with Hugh. It's not the number of people that's driving human-induced climate change, it's the number of high consumers. But about 2 billion people on the planet consume so little that they generate hardly any human-induced greenhouse gas emissions. There's another billion that generate well below the 2 tons per person per year of carbon dioxide equivalent, which is what we're aiming at to reduce its. There's a 1,000-fold difference in greenhouse gas emissions per person between the richest 2% and the poorest 2%. Indeed, many of the people I work in cities in Africa, Asia, and Latin America with slum dwellers. They have no net emissions of greenhouse gases because their work in recycling and recovering materials to put it back into production chains outweighs the very, very low amounts of fossil fuels they use. But I was asked to talk about urban poverty reduction and climate change adaptation. And this is a settlement in Manila. Unfortunately, this could be a settlement in so many different cities. 1 in 7 of the world's population lives in settlements like this. 1 billion urban dwellers that are invisible in official records, invisible in maps, usually not on voters' register, very often not able to get their kids into schools or healthcare because you need a legal address to access those. How do we begin addressing their needs, their priorities? How do we begin to identify risk and vulnerability in places like these? I live in Clapham. I live in a house that meets building standards. I have water piped 24 hours a day of drinking quality. I have sewers, I have drains, I have insurance for my home, I have insurance for my possessions. I can walk to a healthcare centre that guarantees to treat me. I have emergency services if things go wrong. I have someone that I can go and talk to who represents me in the local government, represents me in Parliament if any of these go wrong. None of this is to do with climate change. Yet it gives me an enormous resilience to extreme weather and is actually the basis for resilience. These people have none of those. They have no water, they have no sewers, they have no drains. They can only access healthcare if they can afford it. They don't access schools. There's no emergency services. If their house comes on fire, if they get flooded, there's no emergency service to help them move. There's no compensation if they lose their homes and all their assets. This is in Dhaka, in Bangladesh. You can guess the height of the floodwaters by just how high the stilts are. Again, these people have no basis for coping with climate change adaptation. From climate change that's human-induced, to which they contributed almost nothing. This is Manila. The tragedy is, I could give you a photo like this twice a year, 3 times a year, because that's how devastating extreme weathers are in Manila and in much of the Philippines. Almost all deaths from extreme weather are in low and middle income nations. There's a few exceptions, but they are exceptions. If we look at the last 20 years, almost all deaths from extreme weather, 96%, 97%, have been in low and middle income nations. Now this isn't because of greater exposure. The United States, Japan have very high exposure to hurricanes. Yet the death rate when they hit is often 1/20th, 1/30th, 1/40th of that if it hits the Philippines, if it hits Dhaka. And of course, more intense extreme weather events, more frequent extreme weather events, are one of the most likely impacts from human-induced climate change in the next 10 to 15 years. And of course, in cities like this, there is no competence, there's no capacity to address these issues. It's very difficult to be resilient to climate change if none of your development needs are met. Most informal settlements are on floodplains, on steep slopes, right beside rivers, right beside the coast. These are generally the only places that low-income groups can actually find land where they can build or find cheap rental accommodation. Ironically, the more dangerous the site, usually the better it serves them because it's cheap. And it's generally only in the dangerous sites that you get good access to employment centres. So you choose to live in very risky sites because it means you can get an income. It means you can feed your household. Most of the cities I work with in Africa and Asia have no storm drains. Have no storm drains. Cities of 5 million, 10 million, 15 million in the case of Kinshasa. They're cities that have been built, that have developed, with none of the basis in infrastructure and services to reduce risk, to reduce flood risk. Cities where you get incredibly high concentrations of low-income groups living in central city areas, where the heat island effect is so dramatic. I work in Bhubaneswar. In Bhubaneswar, I avoid certain times of the year. It gets to 46 degrees centigrade. And if climate change is going to push that up 2 to 3 degrees, and of course, as was pointed out in one of the other presentations, how difficult it is to earn a living at such a temperature. In Bhubaneswar, the women who form a large part of the construction, the cheap construction labour, start work an hour early, have to stop work in the midday for 2 to 3 hours. And of course that means more inconvenient working hours, lower hours worked, and lower incomes.